Okay, so let's look at the character of Sheila. In many ways, Sheila is a character who we can admire. She makes changes in her life. The arrival of the inspector is, I suppose, a catalyst for her. It starts her to think. It starts her thinking about the world in a different way, and that in itself is admirable. But what we have to remember is that even though Sheila moves towards a more positive outlook in life, an outlook that would be more applicable with the thoughts of the inspector, who is the mouthpiece of Priestley, so the thoughts of Priestley. Even though she moves in that direction, we have to remember that she is coming from quite a negative starting point. She's coming from a point where she is selfish, where she is complacent, where she is self-absorbed. The first time that we come across Sheila, again, it's that opening tableau where we have the stage directions that serve to expose each character as an individual, so the exposition of the stage directions. Now, what we have here is a young woman who is described as very pleased with life and excited. And what those two things do is they bring us to this word here, which is complacency. And that's really the biggest fault with Sheila, that she's complacent. She's too happy with her lot. She thinks that her world is a perfect world and she doesn't need to look beyond it. As we go through the play, we realise that her dad and her mum suffer from this sort of moral myopia, moral short-sightedness. And that's something that Sheila suffers from at the start. But happily, what we have with the inspector is that he opens her eyes. He allows her to see things as they actually are. He allows her to peek above that wall that her mother has built round the family and see what life is like for others beyond that wall. And when she sees that, she understands that she's got a role to play in helping those who are not in such a fortunate social position as she is. So, if we want one word to sum up the young Sheila, the early Sheila, it's that she's complacent, that she suffers from this complacency. And it's there with her being very pleased with life. Okay, so the first time that she speaks then, she speaks gaily. She's childishly teasing Gerald and her daddy. And she does that when she speaks to Gerald, she speaks possessively. And what that does perhaps is it shows an eagerness on her part for the relationship. Again, to be possessive over one's partner or loved one perhaps suggests a lack of confidence, because if you're confident or trusting, then you don't need to be possessive. Possessive is perhaps coming from a situation of weakness or a situation where you feel like you need to defend something. Now, of course, as Act 1 goes along, we realise that there is this lack of confidence, and perhaps she's justified in not trusting Gerald, and of course that's borne out in Act 2. So we have this girl who seems happy, and yet underneath it there's this perhaps lack of trust. What we also have is a playfulness in her character. She calls her mother mummy, yet she's in her early 20s, and she has this sort of mock aggressiveness which she also uses. So there is a level of immaturity there. Immaturity. And perhaps that immaturity links in to a lack of confidence. That's a very scrubbly immaturity, but you know what it means. There is the underlying problem, though, that becomes apparent in Act 1 when Gerald says, "I've been trying long enough, haven't I, to be part of the family?" And Sheila is pointedly silent. And then what she does is she responds to him half playfully, half serious, suggesting that she's not secure enough in this relationship to know how far to take it. And that links back to the previous point we had about a lack of confidence, a lack of trust. If she knew how far she could take it, if she knew where she was, perhaps in a position of power or authority, you wouldn't have that half playful, half serious tone which Priestley uses here. So what he's bringing in relation to Sheila is this sense of ambiguity, this sense that she's uncertain about some things. And I think that's quite a nice little point to raise, because what we have here is a character who becomes more and more certain as the play develops. Berlin has moments of doubt. He says in Act 3, I would give thousands, and yet in Act 1 he wouldn't give pennies. You have that idea of Eric, who learns and yet is so very aggressive with his mother, who takes on responsibility and yet is still needing that drink. So what you have with Sheila more than any other character is a character who comes into themselves, who develops in a way that allows Sheila to become more certain of who she is and what she should do in this world. So if Sheila gains anything, she gains a sense of certainty. She knows what direction she's going to go on from here on in. What you also have with Sheila too, before she gives her reasonings, before she speaks honestly with Gerald, the use of the hyphens again. So it suggests a lack of fluidity. It suggests hesitation, and that hesitation links to the idea of her being uncertain. Now, what you also have with Sheila is the idea that she represents, and as she does, as the play develops, we see how deeply she represents a different point of view from that of her mum. Remember, in terms of age and gender, what we have in this play is a society that will just repeat the mistakes of previous generations, so everything goes in a circle. So what Mrs. Berlin had to cope with as a young woman is what she believes Sheila will have to cope with as a young woman. However, Sheila makes it clear that that's not going to be the way for her, that she's not going to be like that. Mrs. Berlin says to Sheila that she'll have to get used to Gerald putting his business before her, and she says that that she won't get used to it. And she says half playfully to Gerald, so be careful. And what she's doing there is suggesting, even at this stage, that there's something different about Sheila. And that difference is perhaps what will give us hope as the play continues. You also have with Sheila the understanding that she and her brother are very closely linked. This is a cold family. Her mum is described as being cold. And we have a suggestion that perhaps her dad isn't a particularly well-respected man. She does mock her father at the very start, but in a caring way. It's not the sort of sardonic, deeply critical comments that we have in Act 3. But what you do have is this closeness between Sheila and Eric. And one way that that's affirmed is in the use of colloquialisms, squiffy and ass, both of which they use. And it indicates that here in Act 1 that Sheila and Eric share something, they share a link, and that becomes more apparent as the play progresses, because we know how this foreshadows what will happen in Act 3 when the family split, with Sheila and Eric on one side of the divide and Mr. and Mrs. Berlin on the other. Now remember, with Sheila too, as well as trying to find admirable traits, we also have to realise that there are some things within her personality that we have to describe merely as flaws. And one of the things that perhaps is wrong with Sheila in Act 1 is this idea that perhaps she's shallow. Whenever she gets the ring, she's really exuberant. She's really happy with that ring, very excited about having it. And again, she says to Gerald, "Oh, is it the one that you wanted me to have?" As if she's accepting that role of deference, or that role of the meek wife and the powerful husband. What you have also is that she seems to be in awe of the splendour of the ring, and accepting perhaps of this patriarchal relationship that is expected between husband and wife. Now that's contrary to what she already said, when she was half playful and half serious and she said to him to be careful. That's contrary to the idea of their marriage that she had just a few minutes ago. So what again you have here is a character who is just a little bit uncertain, who's not quite sure what way things should be. Now, when the inspector arrives, Sheila's in the drawing room and she comes to find out what happened. And what she wants to do is she wants to find out what is happening within the room. And one of the words or phrases that sort of tickles her interest or allows her to come back into that room to try and find out what's happening is that idea of being on the streets, of Eva ending up on the streets, which is a euphemism for prostitution. So when Sheila comes back into the room, it's curiosity that brings her in, which is not particularly an appealing characteristic. And remember, in Act 2, her mum accuses her of nothing but morbid curiosity. So this idea of being curious and anything that's salacious, anything that's gossipy, is obviously something that's part of Sheila's early character. When she's first introduced to the inspector asks her to stay, and Berline's not happy about that. But what he wants to do is he wants to allow Sheila to find out what's happening. And so the stage direction for Sheila is that she comes farther in, which perhaps suggests her willingness to be involved in the inspector's investigation, foreshadowing her ability to come closer to his way of thinking. And that stage direction, coming farther in, is important because it's repeated in Act 3, but it's not Sheila who comes farther in then, it's Eric. So the repetition of that metaphorical stage direction is important because both Sheila and Eric choose to come farther in, i.e. they make that decision to get involved, not to be defensive, not to be dismissive, but to be actively involved, and they do that by coming farther in. Now, also what you have is the idea that Sheila's interested to find out what happened to Eva, and what she does is something important. First of all, she exclaims in distress when she hears the news, and then she parallels her position with that of Eva's. You know, how could something so shocking happen just at the time when she was so happy? So what she does is something similar to what her brother does. There's Eva's situation, there's Sheila's situation, and Sheila makes a link between the two. Now the link is only based on time, that there was one person being so miserable just at the point when she was being so happy, but it's a bridge, it's a link nonetheless. And you have Eric doing the same thing, because do you remember you have let's see if I can get blue up, there we go. So there's Eric, he makes the situation, and there's Eva. And do you remember he says about, well, why shouldn't they try for higher wages? We try for higher prices. So he makes that link. So these sort of empathic bridges that both Sheila and Eric make are important, because again, they're the younger generation making those, therefore hope for the future, and also it brings Sheila and Eric closer. You know, they're a little unit. They represent something that we should hold true to, hope for a future generation that thinks differently, thinks in a more progressive way. Sheila begins to understand perhaps this interconnectivity between all their lives, which is something that Priestley, really makes obvious when the inspector says, it's all about a chain of events, the past, present and future being in some ways linked. And the inspector says it would all do us a bit of good if sometimes we put ourselves in the places of these young women. And that's what that's what Sheila does with Eva, just in the same way as what Eric does with Eva in the early act. Okay, but what we also have to remember too is that there are elements of Sheila's character that are less than admirable, and one of the things that we would have to say about her is that she does act cowardly here. The inspector shows her the photograph of the girl, and when Sheila recognises it as Eva, what does she do? She runs out. Okay, she runs out. Now remember, Eric runs as well. Eric runs too. So these two characters are linked in terms of positivity, but they're also linked in terms of negativity. Both Sheila and Eric run, but they both choose to come back. And they're both linked with that phrase, farther in. So the fact that she chooses to come back, I think, is important, because it shows that she's got potential, okay? That she's got potential. But it also shows perhaps that, she is selfish. She was cowardly in that action. When she returns, she looks as if she's been crying. Perhaps she has realised her responsibility. And that maybe prompts the inspector to say that she's not entirely responsible, just partly to blame, just as your father is. So he is not so harsh with her because he recognises that she already feels some sense of responsibility. Compares to how he speaks to Mrs. Burling, which is sharply and severely, because he knows that she is impervious to any sort of responsibility. Sheila's confession is an important one because it really just bears out how shallow she is. The reason why that she couldn't be sorry for Eva is because Eva was prettier than her. Again, this idea of external appearances, this idea of superficiality is something that Sheila is closely linked to in Act 1. Now, of course, it's an idea that her mum is linked to all the way through. In Act 3, she dismisses the inspector because he didn't even look like an inspector. So superficiality is something that her mum stays, firmly embedded in, whereas it's something that Sheila learns to move away from. But her confession makes it clear that she was shallow, that she was immature and self-absorbed, and again, those are flaws in her character. And they cannot be seen as anything other than flaws. She needs to learn a lesson. She needs to learn not to be like that. And therefore the inspector is deliberately curt with her. Short, sharp responses. Yes, but you can't. It's too late. She's dead. Little short, emphatic statements that hopefully let that harsh message be learnt. Something that Sheila can pick up on. And of course that's what we find out as the play continues. Okay. Now, one of the things that Sheila can do is that she can feel things within a room. In Act 2, it's very clear when her mum returns to the room that her mum does not feel the tension within that room, that she speaks in the same haughty and arrogant way. She uses the word impertinent, which Sheila dismisses as a silly word. Mrs. Burling doesn't feel the tension that exists between Sheila and the inspector and Gerald. However, Sheila is different. She feels can you hear that rain? She feels the tension immediately. She understands that there's something different about the inspector, and that he brings a particular atmosphere to a room and creates a particular atmosphere between people. So what she does is she recognises that there's something there, and she recognises the atmosphere that's created between herself and Gerald by the inspector and his use of the name Daisy Renton. The inspector's power and insight into the situation is only glimpsed a little bit in this first act, but it's enough for Sheila to ominously predict that the inspector knows. So what Sheila has is a capacity to feel things, that she is empathic, that she understands the difference that people can create within a particular environment. And the audience can see that in Act 2 particularly, because she starts to sense that there's something about the inspector's powers. She gets closer to him in the stage direction, and the stage direction also says that she's wonderingly and dubious. Again, if we keep going back to that first word that we had for Sheila, linked to uncertainty, her uncertainty continues here because the inspector is making her feel doubt and making her wonder about what really he represents or what really he's doing. And what he does is he puts her on the path towards certainty. When she moves closer to him, what she's doing in terms of the stage positioning, by moving closer to him symbolically, she's moving closer to his way of thinking, beginning to accept his moralistic point of view, walking the same path as he walks. As I just mentioned there at the start of Act 2, that the tension between Sheila and Gerald is palpable, and she feels that in comparison to her mother, who doesn't feel it at all. And also what she does is that she criticises Gerald for his gentlemanly concern. He says that he doesn't want her to hear unpleasant and disturbing things. But as Sheila recognises, he didn't grant that same courtesy to Eva. Gerald thinks that Sheila wants to stay because he believes that she wants to see somebody else put through it, that she wants to watch him suffer. And really, when you think about it, that shows very little understanding between Sheila and Gerald. The fact that Gerald could believe Sheila to be, in her own words, a vain and vindictive creature, perhaps illustrate that they don't have that connection. Now, it's clear that they do love each other. They share that moment. They share that look at the start of Act 2. At the start of Act 1, where they share that loving moment looking at each other. And there's a clear affection there between the two, a love there between the two. But whether it's based on true understanding is something that we would have to think about, because in Act 2 it becomes clear that they don't really understand each other. Okay, the inspector understands that Sheila feels guilty, that she feels responsible, and therefore she doesn't want to stay and watch Gerald being put through it. It's not that at all. But what she wants to do is perhaps she wants to share something, share the responsibility. So it's as if he can read her mind and comments on her conscience's burden when he states she'll be alone with that responsibility the rest of tonight, all tomorrow and the next. And what you have here is this idea that he really does understand the way her mind works, and therefore it is only logical that she starts to understand how his works. That there is a link between the inspector and Sheila. And of course that link is what gives us hope. Okay. Sheila understands Gerald a bit more than he ever understood her, because she understands that he wanted to be a Prince Charming character, that she understands that at heart Gerald is vain, he's a vain man, and that allows Sheila to have a new sense of maturity. She seemed so immature in Act 1. She was petty. Her language was immature in Act 1. But what she wants to do here is perhaps develop this newfound sense of maturity. She asks Gerald questions in a controlled manner. She's not hysterical. She's not even judgmental in the way that we would expect her to be, because she understands why he did it. She understands that his vanity is his weakness. The fact that Sheila returns the ring is a dramatic sign of her development, of her maturity, because she knows that when she got that ring, she was blinded by its economic value. She was blinded by its sparkles and how much it was worth and how it was the ring that he wanted her to have. But now she realises that marriage is beyond those, something beyond superficiality and sparkles, and that she and Gerald need to get to know each other, that they don't know each other now. So when Gerald says that he will go and hopes that he can return, we get this idea that perhaps what he wants is Sheila more than just a wife, that there is a genuine love and feeling there for Sheila, and the fact that she wants to get to know him again gives us hope that their relationship can be something stronger than what it is at present. What I had mentioned earlier on was Sheila's ability to feel the atmosphere in a room and be affected by it, and here what you have is the difference between Sheila and her mum, because Sheila here, when her mum starts to speak with the same easy tone, Sheila's tone is completely in contrast to it, because she shouts, she exclaims, "Mother, please," and it suggests the nervous state that Sheila's in, because she feels the atmosphere has changed. She knows really where her mother is going, and she realises that her mother's attitude, the superior attitude of her mother's, just doesn't fit into this room anymore. And then Sheila really makes a very important point. What she does is she has this epiphany, this moment of insight, where she realises that because of class has allowed her mum to build up a wall, a dividing wall between her upper class life and the working class who are perhaps sustaining that upper class life. You know, they're the people who make the profit. And what Sheila does is that she recognises that her mum has built this wall up, and she recognises too that the inspector will just break it down. So she knows the weakness of this way of thinking. Now, the wall represents two things, and we've mentioned this many times, but remember, for Mr. Burling and Mrs. Burling, this wall represents a protection, a barrier, preventing them from having to acknowledge those who are socially beneath them. But for Sheila, and what she recognises here, is that this wall is actually a prison. It has trapped her mum into an old, self-absorbed life. The self-absorbed life that allows her to continue with this same easy tone. But that is not reality. That is just living, I suppose, in an anachronistic bubble, in an old-fashioned bubble. And that will be burst by the inspector. And Sheila knows it. Okay, so the barriers of class and age prevent Mrs. Burling from seeing things as they truly are. Mrs. Burling believes that this is nothing but an absurd business. And the idea here is that both Mrs. Burling and Gerald share the same poor opinion of Sheila. Again, here we have this idea about morbid curiosity. Mrs. Burling thinks that Sheila's interest in Eva is just morbid curiosity. And you know, there must be some validation to that, because remember, what brought Sheila back to the room was the curiosity of the euphemism on the streets. But what Mrs. Burling and Gerald both do not understand is that something has happened to Sheila, that in the space of the last hour a little light has been turned on, that she is not the same person, that she's gradually changing, and that is something that they do not understand. Also, you have this idea that Mrs. Burling is described at the start as being a rather cold woman, and it comes apparent here because even when her daughter is nervous and anxious, there's no sense that Mrs. Burling wants to do anything to placate Sheila or to ease her situation. Instead, all she does is criticise her. She's this upbraiding, critical parent, not in any way empathic to how her daughter's feeling. You also have this idea of role reversal, haven't you? Because you have Sheila, who's trying to guide her mum through a moral minefield, who's trying to make sure that her mum does not walk into the trap set for her by the inspector. But unfortunately, Sheila is not going to help her mum in that respect. Her mum is too arrogant and too self-important to accept any help from her daughter. Mrs. Burling constantly makes these links back to Eva and her class. She dismisses the individuality of Eva by just linking her to girls of that class and later on girls of that sort. And even though Sheila is urgently trying to interrupt her mother, trying to help her mother, when her mother has not done anything to help Sheila all the way through, even at this point, we start to feel that there's a difference in Sheila, that she is becoming a character who is more aligned to the thinking of the inspector, who has even got empathy for her mum. When her mum is exposing herself as being so prejudiced and so bigoted, Sheila still tries to help her. That in itself is admirable. Sheila realises everyone must face the truth if they're going to progress. And it's just like in Act 1 when Sheila was upset when she realised what she had done to Eva and the inspector said, "You can't, it's too late, she's dead." These are hard lessons that you have to learn, and the inspector didn't spare Sheila from it, and perhaps Sheila's not sparing anyone else from it, because she knows that the truth has to be faced. There is that little moment where Sheila recognises that the idler who is responsible for Eva's situation is Eric, and we, the audience, recognise that with Sheila. So there is this parity, there is this link between the way the audience thinks and the way Sheila thinks. And of course you've got audience, Sheila, all thinking in the same direction, and that's the same direction as the inspector. So we three are all linked together, the inspector, Sheila, and the audience, all having this shared understanding, thinking in the same way. When Sheila tries to help her mum, as I pointed out in the previous thing, she's just, again, that idea of an upbraiding parent, a critical parent. She's just told to be quiet by her mum, and therefore Sheila doesn't press the issue, because perhaps she understands that her mum needs her to have her eyes opened, and if she's going to have her eyes opened with the bombshell that is Act 3, well, then that has to happen. I suppose it's a bit like lancing a boil. It's painful, but it has to happen. Also, you have that idea that in Act 3, Sheila drops the bombshell when Eric said, how do we know? And Sheila says, she told mother, i.e. Eva told mother. And you could say, is that treacherous? Is that Sheila betraying her mum? No, do you know what it is? It's Sheila understanding that her mum has to face the truth, that there's no point lying. Eric needs to know the truth. Sheila has to face the truth. Mr. and Mrs. Burling have to face the truth. But her mum doesn't face the truth. Her mum says nothing. She just shakes her head and doesn't reply. That's a cowardly action. Now, in terms of dramatic devices, Sheila does become the mouthpiece of the inspector, and of course the inspector is the mouthpiece of Priestley. So what Priestley believes is then translated into what the inspector says, and that's translated into what Sheila now picks up on and what she starts to believe. So there's a clear sense, as I said before, of role reversal, with Mr. and Mrs. Burling being childish and petty in comparison to their children. It says in the stage direction that she's scornful of her father's dismissal of events as he and her mother pretend that not much has happened. Now, she begins in Act 1 mocking her father for his love of port, purple-faced gentleman and all that. But that subtle, gentle mocking of a daughter is now scornful. Now, that's a huge leap, because that suggests no respect. That suggests some sort of breakdown in the relationship. And that becomes more apparent when she says that they seem to have learnt nothing, because she starts to see into the hearts and minds of the assembled company. Now remember, the only person who could see into the hearts and minds earlier was the inspector, but now that idea of sight, that idea of understanding, is something that Sheila has. It's as if the power of the inspector has in some way subtly influenced Sheila. When her mum again tries to criticise her, she says it's you two who are being childish, and she feels that she can criticise the lack of moral development in her parents because she knows that she has developed so much in her own self. In Act 1, you had this idea of camaraderie and a sibling sort of squabbling relationship between Sheila and Eric, yet there was warmth there. And now what we have is a clear development of that Sheila and Eric work as a team. She says, I suppose we're all nice people now, and Eric agrees with her, because what they have done is they have created this split on the stage. On one side you've got the Burlings, Mr. and Mrs., and what they represent is they represent class, they represent the idea of social inferiority, social superiority, they represent old-fashioned values. And then you have Sheila and Eric, and they represent progression, they represent hope for the future, they represent socialism in a very weakened form here. They've taken the main aspects of socialism and they've started to make connections. And so they represented this idea that perhaps the future can be a better place, that the youth can create a society more attuned to the thinking of the inspector and of Priestley. What you also have too is the idea that their elders are carrying on with their wall, building that dividing wall between them, and Sheila moves towards the door. Again, this idea that she has to distance herself from her family, that if she wants to stay true to the inspector, she has to be further removed from her mum and dad. And that's something that with her move towards the door, she seems willing enough to do. And again, that idea of feeling the atmosphere in the room. Sheila and Eric talk of being frightened, and it creates this ominous atmosphere which they both are attuned to, which they both feel. Mr. and Mrs. Burling and Gerald do not feel it. When Gerald represents the easy way out, Sheila doesn't take it, and that's the key thing. That when Gerald returns, and we understand that he returned to drop the bombshell that the inspector wasn't a real inspector, not to rekindle the relationship with Sheila, but to drop that bombshell again, to be the fairy tale prince, not for Eva now or Daisy Renton, but to be that fairy tale prince for Mr. and Mrs. Burling, to be the kind of son-in-law he always wanted. And when he comes in and drops that bombshell, he takes confidence in his position of the fairy tale prince, of the returning hero. So much confidence that he holds up the ring for Sheila to take it back, as if everything that has happened can be so easily forgotten. Which of course it's true for Mr. and Mrs. Burling. Everything that has happened is so easily forgotten for them. And for Gerald, the fact that he holds out that ring, it devalues Sheila, that he thinks that he can just pick that relationship off from where it started, or from where it ended rather. It devalues Sheila. And she rejects it, and we feel happy and proud that she has rejected it. She says that she must think. And, part of you wants her to reject it and wholly and not ever think about it. But the thinking is important, because after all, that's what the inspector was there to make them do, to make them think, not to dismiss things in sweeping judgmental ways. Remember, that's how they got into trouble in the first place. They dismissed the life of Eva in such a sweeping way. But to think about things, that's what he was there for. So the fact that Sheila chooses to think is again another way of understanding that she has listened to the inspector's message. One thing I would say is that in terms of the development between Sheila and Eric, Sheila has learnt more than Eric. But also another thing that you have to remember would be that Sheila was coming from a flawed position at the start. So her progress seems great because she was coming from that complacent, self-absorbed position that her parents had allowed her to occupy for so long.